basically what we talked about in the video that's already up online is that one of my frustrations with James Lindsay is that to criticize current people who are critical race theorists or just critical theorists generally, he makes some sort of like it feels very conspiracy theory esque, much like that meme of the dude from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia with like connecting the straw, like the strings on the pegboard. It's like James Lindsay's whole thing is to go, you know, Foucault is related to this person who's related to Marcuse, and they share together the dialectic. And if you follow all these figures back, you get to Hegel, who started the dialectic, and therefore somehow it's like they're all bad because they can all trace back to Hegel. And my guess is what we get from like why that's a bad thing. I mean, they don't. I can't remember to what extent they come out with it in this video. I feel like they're a little bit more clear in this video about like what the problems are. And like you can imagine already what some of them are, which is that they're going to make some claims like, if not for Hegel, you wouldn't have Soviet-style communism, and since Soviet-style communism bad, anyone who is attached to Hegel, even tangentially, is somehow bad. And so you're going to get weird arguments like this. And they probably don't get too much into that in this video, but this is sort of the reason why they want to make these connections. And it's very superficial to a certain extent because you would rather them address like, well, why is it that believing in Hegel or like accepting or taking bits of Hegel in terms of the dialectic, because remember, like Hegel was a staunch imperialist, taking parts from Hegel in order for it to motivate your emancipatory struggles, why is that bad? Or why does it necessitate Soviet-style communism, right? They never get into those debates because those are a more interesting debate. If you can have, if I can use a dialectic that I borrowed from Hegel and fight for emancipation, but it doesn't lead to like what they conceive of as the bads in Soviet communism, then being connected to Hegel isn't a problem, right? But it becomes like a fear-mongering game. Like, look at all these people we know, and they're all connected. And since they're all connected, it means that all of them are bad because it all goes back to this one figure. We kind of like, we cracked the nut. I think James Lindsay refers to it as like the operating system of the left. So if you understand Hegel, you understand the left because you understand their operating system. And they're going to like talk about Hegel here and sort of describe it. But really, if you want to understand what it is, what people have taken from Hegel, this idea of the dialectic, is simply that there's tensions that get created within the contradictions of any system. So take, for example, capitalism, contradictions form. And through those contradictions, a new synthesis gets formed out of that. And so a lot of people in emancipatory movements speak in that way to explain how the tensions of capitalism give rise to the next thing, right? Which would be something like communism, is the idea. Or in the idea of like a critical race theory, these racial tensions might lead to a post-racial or at least more anti-racial society or something like this, right? But these tensions exist now, and there's contradictions in our current system, which will lead to the better system later, if that makes sense. And why I want to frame this right up front is you can already tell in me sort of describing this that it's kind of benign what I'm saying. In that there's so much to fill out the picture that is missing, that just merely appealing to Hegel's dialectic doesn't tell you all that much. You got to fill in the picture. And so simply talking about a dialectic is more just scholars going, oh, look, here's this thing that other people who were fighting for emancipatory struggles referenced the dialectic and referenced Hegel. And so we are in the same lineage as these people. We are also going to reference similar stuff, but then expand on it or motivate it or change it or, advance the theories, So it's like bringing it all back to Hegel really doesn't tell you all that much. It's interesting, but it doesn't tell you all that much. And it's not some sort of like deep conspiracy, like, I don't know, we're all trying to hide the fact that we're secret Hegelians, because if you knew we were all Hegelians, you somehow would not like us, or I don't know. How many do you get approached on the street, Vienna, and be like, "Are you a Hegelian?" They're coming for you.
Yeah, that's the first thing that people ask, honestly.
Oh my god. So here we go.
Are you a dialectician?
Yeah. The funny thing is, like, I don't even think a ton of people on the left even know what dialectics are. It's such like an academic part of it, I think.
Dialectics is when there's two of something.
Exactly. And so, like, it's weird to refer to it as the operating system of the left, considering that, like, when I'm going to organize people, I don't show up to like the workplace and go, "Have you heard of the good word of Hegel? do you need to learn some dialectics?" Usually not how you organize a workplace or something, right? I think the other funny thing is, like, the way, I mean, there's debate within Marxist scholarship about this, but the interesting thing about the dialectic is to what extent human action matters to it, whether or not the contradictions in capitalism are just a necessary byproduct of capitalism and therefore will happen regardless of what you do. And so in that sense, it almost like doesn't, it's not a useful thing in terms of like organizing or any of that, because it's just going to do what it does, you know? It's an interesting way of like a sociological theory to understand the process in which societies and systems change, but it's not something you can like apply. So to call it an operating system is very, very, very weird. Very weird. Just like how DNA is the operating system of life, and it's not necessary to understand it. The same as for Hegel and socialist CRT. Yeah, exactly. I mean, in a way, like, you're not wrong, Two Cars. We got along just fine with understanding certain things about human beings without knowing that DNA was there in the background. And so it's like, yeah, the dialectic might be a true sociological tool to analyze the changes in history, but they're kind of like, that's an interesting fact about the world. It's not necessarily something that you can just like use and apply like an operating system. All right. Let's watch this. The first, I remember it's a bit slow going because they're going to name drop a whole bunch of shit at the beginning, but here we go. Oh yeah. Changing tides. I think we got like 5 minutes into it, but I had to mention this before. Now I remember as well. I'm pretty sure Changing Tides here is a reference to George Soros. And the reason is because the Tides Foundation is the George Soros Foundation that fights for climate justice and stuff like this. And a lot of what Michael O'Fallon, who is the Christian nationalist that funds James Lindsay, super anti-George Soros person. I mean, even James Lindsay is an anti-George Soros person who's they're gonna, in the early bits of this, they're gonna mention something that critiques George Soros as well, or at least vaguely like point to him. So I feel like this Changing Tides idea is referencing George Soros in some weird way. They also believe a lot of the Great Reset conspiracy, Build Back Better, all that stuff, kind of conspiracy shit. So what the hell is this? I don't know, KJ. This is, we're going to watch James Lindsay and Michael O'Fallon sit by a beach and talk about Hegel and the dialectic.
You know, we've been talking about this for a long time, and
there's two bros talking about
going back, we've talked about Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard. We've talked about the influences, of course, of Bell and Crenshaw, D'Angelo, and others, Kendi.
Marcuse.
Marcuse, we just spoke about in our previous
See
conversation.
what I mean?
That
It's always
goes
sunny in
back
Philadelphia.
to
Look at all
the
these
Frankfurt
people.
School of Critical Theory, and then 1968, Marx, Mao, and Marcuse, and that great revolution that was the start of something, but it never really took. That was, I think what you're seeing is kind of the echoes of that, but on steroids today. But if we go way back, James, and we go back to where the root of these ideas came from, if we're looking at Rousseau,
Sure.
and the idea of collective liberty, the social contract.
The May 6/8 reference and being like, oh, nowadays is so much worse than May 6/8 that was global and almost resulted in the president of France fleeing the country because he thought that the revolution was going to execute him. And calling 2020 and 2021 that on steroids is just so brain dead.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, where's that?
If 6/8 had worked, though.
I have to comment on James.
Yellow vests.
Yeah, but I mean that's the appreciate the fight against Macron, but it wasn't to the point where Macron feared for his life kind of thing.
I think he did flee cities at one point, but it was also okay. Since we're talking about stance and appearance, just shave your fucking head, dude. Why the comb over? Why do they do this?
Why do they do it? I don't know. I never understand the comb over either. I've got my spaces. You know what I mean? I got no hair up there. It's just the way that it goes. I don't know. I think it would look weirder to do the comb over. I just let the spaces be, or I compensate with this. It's all right. Live your life, dude. No judgment. But I do I mean, he jokes about. I think he sells merch that says "Power Stance" on it, and it's him with his legs spread wide. They're like, "I am powerful. Look at me expose my crotch area to the world."
Yeah. The Tory power stance.
Yeah. And I think in a bit, Michael O'Fallon's going to put his leg up too. Because they're men. And they like to dominate what looks to be a fire pit. In our colorful Muskoka chairs.
Why is it on fire? That's annoying.
Why is it no fire? Probably because it's too windy. Which you can hear on the mics.
Nick knows the Tory power stance.
But then there is someone else that really seemed to... I've addressed issues like alchemy.
Yeah.
And explaining what alchemy is in the modern context.
Alchemy.
Yep. But really that terminology was really given a rebirth within a philosophical, understanding of things by who?
Hegel, the great sorcerer of German idealism. Really, you have to understand him that way.
Yeah.
Hegel's a complicated character because...
Such a natural in for this conversation, right? It's just so natural. Just two bros sitting by the fire talking about Hegel.
If you've tried to read Hegel, the first thing that you notice is that it doesn't make any sense at all. It's kind of tortured explanations. He has this one fairly famous explanation where he tries to talk about sound and heat or something like this, and it's just the heat is generated by the sound, and the sound of the heat is the generation of the heat and the sound. And it's
the British Tories spent millions of dollars
learning the power stance,
trying to find a intimidating stance or whatever, something that made them look powerful, and that was the stance that they came up with.
Amazing. That reminds me of I can't remember where I got this from, but there was some what's the thing where you get a bunch of people in a room, like a market testing kind of thing, right? And they found that when you talk and you point, that really annoys people. So they teach politicians to do this move with the thumb on the fist. And then people find this way more appealing. So if you watch a lot of Democratic politicians, when they talk, they don't point. They do this like weird thumb fist gesture.
Weird. I feel like if they did finger guns, that would appeal to Gen Z voters.
Pew, 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 pew.
Yeah, like, boo! You know?
Yeah.
Also, KJ said something about an affair this guy was
I feel
involved
like
in.
KJ is a bot, so KJ could share what KJ wants, but unrespectable,
No.
but generous. Oh yeah, the so-called affair. Okay, yeah. Fair. He was involved in his golden. I read it on Wiki. Yeah. Yeah, we've talked before in some of our other videos about the so-called square hoax and all that. The so-called stuff is or the hoaxes were not great. There's many criticisms of what they did. Included among the articles that were published were arguments that dogs engaged in rape culture and that men can... Yeah, so for example, the dogs engaged in rape culture thing, we've already been over. But the thing is, they falsified data, and the analysis actually was interesting. So what they measured, because again, it's a fake study, was they had people rate dogs in a park, and then it was whether or not owners would step in to disrupt same-sex humping in the dog park, or whether they let it go, or the same for not same-sex. And the data that they made up was that owners were more likely to intervene when the dogs were engaged in same-sex than they were engaged in heterosex, I guess, right? And so then part of the thing is, that is an interesting subset of data that tells you something about the world. It tells you something about people and how they interact with their animals. And they just made it up and then go, ha 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 ha, it got published. But it's like, of course that would get published. That's an interesting set of data. And so it's like, it's not really a hoax if it's an interesting set of data, that you fraudulently made up. I think the thing is, they do engage in the discussion in rape culture and dogs. And you, in the discussion section of that paper, and you could argue that maybe the discussion section gets a bit silly. To what extent can dogs engage in a rape culture, whatever. But it's the discussion section of the paper where people discuss things, right? So they were found because they did this manipulation and fraudulently submitted data. Peter Boghossian ended up getting under a review, basically, by the ethics board at his university, and was prevented from doing any more future research until he took some classes on this stuff. So they received some sanction for it. What they did was not great, and the conclusions that they draw from what they did were silly at best.
Very terrible writing. One of his contemporaries in Germany, Schopenhauer, said that it's basically some of the worst writing. It's an embarrassment to the German people, and all. If people will make fun of German philosophy forever because of their dear Hegel. So it's very difficult to understand what Hegel was about.
Boring.
Right.
And that's reflected in the fact that, so a lot of people don't realize Hegel wrote his first major work in mostly 1806. It came out 1807. That's Phenomenology of Spirit is how we usually translate it. Its full title is something like what is it? The something of science, the roots of science, or something like this. The phenomenology of spirit, and he was trying to lay out, like all the idealists, a very systematic philosophy, and he actually, published in 1807, became something of a huge philosophical rock star by the 1820s when he died. And once he died, there was this huge kind of movement, and it actually split immediately into what were called the old Hegelians, who were very conservative, and the new Hegelians, who were very, very, what we would describe as progressive, and they had radically different interpretations of what Hegel wrote. So the point there being that Hegel was difficult to understand. It's not, if you can have radically different progressive versus conservative interpretations immediately in the wake of his death that are at diametrical odds to one another, it's pretty clear that, he wasn't clear.
See, I don't think that's accurate in the sense of what I brought up, which is that Hegel's dialectic was, again, things come to a contradiction and then they resolve themselves, and it's this like ongoing cycle, right? So the progressives adopted that to say, hey, look, what this cycle means is that the contradictions are getting better to a certain extent. So it's like we went from feudalism to a kind of liberal capitalism, and we're going to go from this capitalism to this other thing that's better, and so on, right? There's going to be some progression towards something better. Now that you could have that interpretation of Hegel's work, or you can do it the way Hegel did it and came to the conclusion of being pro the emperor and stuff like this, and that the contradictions have more to do with other like the spirit coming together of the society and stuff like this. Hence his work, the phenomenology of spirit, and that there's a will, like a will in the Rousseauian sense of like a spirit of the people. And you can see how that was adopted by like maybe some far right thinkers in terms of like the Völkisch idea of Germany that was then adopted by the Nazis and stuff like this. So it's not like these things have like, you got here like two people misunderstood what Hegel was doing and therefore took two different things from him. They took what they needed from Hegel and then did their own thing, much like people can do today with like Marx and like other stuff, right? It's like weird because their argument here is that there's some sort of like, you know, since all leftism goes back to Hegel, therefore all leftism is bad. Yet people pick and choose from various philosophies all the fucking time, and it's not a problem. Like, just because people on the left took something from Hegel doesn't mean that I don't know, Hegel was not clear, or that there's some innate thing that's bad that's now tainted all of leftism or some shit like that.
And the engine of left thought is young Hegelianism. The most kind of one of the more prominent young Hegelians was Feuerbach, and Feuerbach was a mentor to Marx, who was also a young Hegelian. And it was the young Hegelian idea that Marx said that he stood on its head to create dialectical materialism. So the engine of pretty much all of the left, and if you even want to see it as a faith system of the left, over the last 200 years can be traced back to Hegel. So he's the character. He is the alchemist. He was, in fact, an alchemist. And he based his philosophy on alchemical formulas. So people in more modern times who are talking about alchemy of finance notwithstanding.
So this is what gets me to the George Soros thinking of why it's called Changing Tides. So The Alchemy of Finance is a book by George Soros. And what James Lindsay is doing here is a wink and a nudge to his co-host, who is very anti-George Soros, but also to the people who believe in a lot of George Soros conspiracy theories. It's this idea of like, look, just like Hegel was an alchemist, and George Soros wrote this book that's The Alchemy of Finance. So he was an alchemy in the economic sense. That therefore there's some sort of link between George Soros and Hegel, and therefore of all the left, we're all just terrible, bad alchemists. And
it's also like he's talking about Marx as a young Hegelian, as if like one of the big things that happened in Marx's life wasn't, you know, his break with young Hegelianism. like that was his whole shit. Like,
yeah,
that's why
Capital is very
like
not Hegelian in many ways.
They wrote a whole fucking book called The Critique of Feuerbach. Fuck, do you say that?
Feuerbach?
Feuerbach? Because it's F-E-U-E. Feuerbach?
Well, most
of
Feuerbach's stuff was a critique of religion. So it's like, it's weird, like, somehow linking this back to Feuerbach. Like, yes, Marx was influenced by Feuerbach, but it was more to do with, like, religion in a lot of ways.
Like, yeah, and it's also, like, I don't know, the idea that, like, you can't be influenced by something without being part of it is a weird sort of assertion. Like,
yeah.
Just the idea that, like, you can't read something and be like, huh, that's interesting. I'm gonna critique the shit out of it, but like,
Well, I mean, like,
it was an alright read.
we've pointed this out both now with Hegel and Feuerbach, which is like, yes, both of these figures influenced Marx, in part because they were taught at the schools that Marx had to go to, because they were just like when I went to school, there's like a zeitgeist in the air, right? So certain philosophies become like popular, and that's what they get taught at in the academy, you know. Mark, yeah, did I, Mr. Mark, Karl Marx,
Yeah.
but it's like, yeah, he swam in this stuff, so of course he was going to be influenced by it. But just like merely being influenced by some of it, and then, you know, there's a reason why we talk about Marx and we almost never talk about Feuerbach, because like Marx took some things from Feuerbach and then built a whole fucking theory, a new thing out of it, you know. Where's Feuerbach's Das Kapital, you know? Hi, I'm Mike from Russia. Are you there, Vienna, or the...
Yeah, it's just like, I don't know. It's just fucking stupid.
Yeah.
And it's also like how, I don't know, and it's not unique to like right-leaning people, obviously, where it's like, you know, it's how Marx gets watered down into a political economist. It's how, like, you know, all of these sorts of people get watered down into like whatever tradition they came from and broke from. It's just like an automatic, like, they must be this because we must have neat, distinct categories
I was going to
tracing
say,
back.
it's an attempt to
forever.
essentialize them. I mean,
Yeah.
and like that in part of that, that's not like, as you were saying, like that doesn't necessarily trace back to like conservative thought or what these two are doing. That's, I feel like, an effect of history in many ways, in scholarship, trying to like form coherent narratives of what happened, and in ways they end up accidentally trying to essentialize people who are complex and multifaceted. You know, he's rugged though.
South Carolina, no.
Who's
South
rugged?
Carolina,
James
that
Lindsay?
makes a bit more sense. I think they're referencing James Lindsay.
Eee.
No, you're not allowed to do that. Please, no.
If you want to remove any rugged charm from him, watch him play with swords.
Can we watch the
Are
Ben Shapiro
operating within
buying
that.
buying wood from?
That's an old one. When he bought the slab.
No, but I love that video. It's so funny.
Maybe later, as a treat, as a palate cleanser when this is done.
Tradition. But you see, all these people you just mentioned, especially Marcuse. Marcuse refers to Hegel over and over and over again in all of his books, all of his essays. You look at the other Frankfurt School guys, they're very Hegelian. In fact, what they did, in a sense, is if Marx stood Hegel on his head, they stood Hegel back upright again. They went back to the very early Marx when he was his most Hegelian, or young Hegelian, we should say, and kind of reinvented that and injected more Hegel. So Hegel is the engine of kind of all of critical theory. He's the engine of Marxism. He's the...
Marcuse took his Das Kapital and then took a syringe and like removed some of the Hegel and then like stuck it back into Das Kapital and injected more Hegel into it.
the engine of even the postmodern, even though the postmodern philosophers were very critical of Hegel in a lot of ways, their operating system, if you will, the engine inside of their vehicle is still the Hegelian philosophy as interpreted by that progressive group coming straight out of his time. And people don't understand. And this is actually, I think, important because if we do want to, as many people do, and I know we dip in and out of it some, if we want to characterize it as a faith system, you have to understand Hegel. You have to understand Hegel's metaphysics. And once you understand Hegel's metaphysics, you can start to see the metaphysical structure under the logic of what is now just described as the left.
I wanted to fill this in too, because this is another thing I commented on. I think I commented on this last time, but then it got deleted when we had to end the stream or whatever because the internet went out, was that it's weird him talking to Michael O'Fallon here, who is a Christian nationalist, and he's talking to him about how this dialectical framework from Hegel is itself a like faith position that is then adopted by leftists generally. And you would think that that comes with like an insult towards like religious people. Like it would be weird to say, "Hey, this thing we don't like, it's a religion, just like you have a religion." But like I think why like I feel like the take that people like Michael O'Fallon have is they're not offended by that because it's like in many ways it shows that it's like it's not a science, it's a religion, and so therefore should be treated like a religion. In the sense that like it should not be taught in schools and stuff like this. Where at school you should be just taught your maths, any introduction of like race at all in the curriculum is bad or something like this, right? So I feel like that's like the approach happening here. Although like it's weird because James Lindsay is an atheist, and part of me thinks in his head he's going, yeah, this faith over here, it's bad because it's a faith, just like I think all faiths are bad. Meanwhile, he's being funded by this Christian nationalist. It's a very weird dynamic.
So he's the guy.
Sorry, were you going to say something?
I was just gonna say that it feels like they're talking about like speccing a certain class in a video game, where it's like, oh, you chose leftism, so that means that like your first unlock is Hegelianism, and you gotta like, you know, continue your upgrade tree from there. Like, it's just such a weird, like, I don't know, way of thinking about influence and lineage.
I guess my first read would have been the Communist Manifesto, but that's like the most left thing that I remember reading when I was really young. I don't know, but unlike you, I have read some Hegel and I don't remember any of it. So, so I guess it's the equivalent of you in the sense that Hegel sucks. I'm just gonna say it. No offense to anyone who's a Hegel scholar who like really loves Hegel, but I did not find his work easily digestible. I guess would be the way to put it.
And so you look at how also even modern politics uses the same sort of dialectical system, you know, the whole thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Right. Yeah, that's Hegel took that from Kant and made that the
So
center.
why don't we all go back to
and
Kant?
so when you say thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, we can talk about that a lot. But the first thing to
And
draw
Kant
out,
was
since I
influenced
just
by
mentioned
Hume.
religion, is that as a trinity.
Mm-hmm.
There are three things happening here. And this is how Hegel thought. He thought in lots of trinities or triplets. And so thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which he borrowed from Kant and made a little bit more concrete. Literally, he changed some of it to abstract and concrete. Mirrors that. You have this idea, like, you know, God the Father is a thesis. Jesus the Son is an antithesis. The Holy Spirit becomes a synthesis of these ideas, the operation of God's will in the world. And so he conceived of all of these theological but also philosophical concepts that he was wrestling with at the time to create an idealistic, systematic philosophy of everything. He conceived of that in these kind of Trinitarian triplets. And this one, the dialectical process, so that's the engine, right? If you wanted to say, how does the Hegel car go? What makes Hegel's car go? It is the dialectical process, which is that you have an idea, a thesis, you meet it up against its contradictions. He was huge in saying that everything contains its own contradiction. So you have your thesis, its contradiction, its antithesis, and when you contemplate those things in the right way, you end up with a broader understanding of a greater total, which he called the synthesis.
So like this is some things that I already stipulated there, but like I don't know why he wants to connect it to like a trinity as like an analogy. Like I wonder. I would guess that Hegel would make those kind of analogies himself. I'm going to take, I guess, James' words on that, or like that it's somehow connected to Hegel appealing in some way to like trinities and finding patterns.
What is this? Are you guys kidding me?
Whoa! Hello, diuretic coverweight. Welcome. Restore Rhodesia. What is this? Am I getting bombarded with Oh no, this is racism. Yep.
What is this? Are you guys kidding me?
Yeah, I wonder if what's gonna happen is I'm gonna get a bunch of follows now. As what do they call this? Brigading? Oh, we'll see how it goes. This might be annoying for 2 seconds. I mean, but notice, I will say,
What is this? Are you
I
guys
have a
kidding
lot
me?
of James Lindsay
I
fans.
got him.
A lot of James Lindsay fans that want to come and tell me that there's nothing racist about James Lindsay, and yet we are getting bot rated by people saying restore Rhodesia, which itself
What is this? Are you guys kidding me?
which itself was a very racist state. So there you have it. Restore the empire just so we can over.
What is this? Are you guys kidding me?
Just open the mod tools. I had about 600 follows bots during my stream a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, it's really annoying. I don't know how high it's gonna go. It's okay. Oh, are we done?
What is this?
Oh,
Are you
no.
guys kidding me?
I love that we've been. It's like we've been infected by David Menzies. But yes, just turn off your alerts. Oh, that's a good point. We're
What is
I've
this? Are
never
you guys
had this
kidding me?
before, so I've never had to go and turn off my my alerts. I wonder if there's a way to how best to turn it off. Oh wait, are we done? We might be done. All right, we're done. That's fair. Now I can't even remember what I was talking about. Oh yeah, the Trinity thing. I don't know. There's like an element of like why make it again, why try it's like he's trying to be like Hegel is the left's faith. Just like Hegel believed in Trinitarian stuff, therefore the left using it's religious. Like, I don't know. It's just like thanks for filling in this useless and pointless information for leftists. Considering that most of the people who came afterwards that borrowed from Hegel were atheists, like Feuerbach and Karl Marx, you know.
What is this? Are you guys kidding me?
I'll find a way to block
Kant's
this.
called the synthesis, actually.
Oh my
Right.
god.
So you're looking at the
Rhodesian
concept then
people.
that absolute truth is not knowable in essence because of the, let's say, I know that Pete uses the term reality
is this?
tunnels,
Are you
but
guys kidding me?
because of our influence, because of our ethnicities, our lived experiences and so forth. So with this, in a modern context, it's more of, well, you have the thesis that you're presenting to me, which I have an antithesis in terms of my understanding of
What
this
is this? Are you guys kidding
is
me?
completely contradictory to yours, so we have to find a synthesis.
Right.
In other words.
Yeah, and so it's
I can't find on Streamlabs how to just shut the thing off. Unless does this work? No, that's the chat box, alert box. Here, that might have done it. Just be sure to ban the bots so that Twitch doesn't ban you. Twitch can be evil when it comes to mass followers on a stream. Yeah. I'll have to go back to figure that out. Oh, it's super annoying. Thank you, racists. Thank you, racists. Oh, you're banning them as they're jumping in. Okay, perfect. That's perfect. Thank you, racists. Thank you for being racist. You're very wonderful. I'm glad you decided to stand for your father figure here in James Lindsay, who's preaching a bunch of bullshit, so that you can come into my chat and praise a country that was a white nationalist country that subjugated black people, to just show how your allegiance to James Lindsay is just as fucked up as James Lindsay himself, in that you're allies in this. So good for you. Congratulations, and go fuck yourself.
interesting you brought up absolute
Look at
knowledge
satellite.
because
What was that, Piano?
Just what a sad life they must
Yeah.
lead.
Oh, wait, that's daddy racist to them, not father? Okay, I'm sorry. Daddy racist. I'm sorry I upset you by criticizing daddy racist, but your daddy racist sucks.
Hegel did believe in the perfectibility of knowledge, perfectibility of ideas. In fact, the perfectibility of ideas is sort of the core of his system. The idea is how, in fact, do you perfect ideas? And so the dialectical process for Hegel was the process of perfecting the ideas. And so for him, he talks about it in terms
Almost
of
like it's a
spirit,
battle,
in particular,
like a
phenomenology of
marketplace of
spirit. What's the
ideas.
phenomenon? How do we understand the phenomenon? That's phenomenology of spirit, Geist, in German. And so he's talking about subjective spirit, objective spirit, and then eventually the synthesis is going to be absolute spirit. And so you have, what is the spirit? People are familiar with the phrase, the term Geist in a compound word, Zeitgeist, which is the spirit of the times. Hegel didn't talk about Zeitgeist a lot. He mentioned it, but he talked more about Weltgeist, world spirit, the current of the way that the world is moving. Not just some local, spirit of the times kind of thing, but the whole big picture, how the world is developing, the world spirit. And his belief was, in fact, that when the dialectical process is pushed along far enough, and you finally have every contradiction exposed, everything contains its own contradiction, and when you have all the contradictions brought to the surface, exposed and synthesized, then the ideas become perfected. The ideas become, the world spirit becomes aware of itself, and it actualizes as the absolute spirit, or his absolute. And this is...
So now that we've heard James describe Hegel's version of the dialectic, does that feel equivalent to Marx's view? Such that all leftists that come after are tainted by this idea. Like, you could see there's elements of the Marxian idea, which is that, like, yeah, you get these contradictions, and then as things go, and I guess in Marx's idea, rather than the sort of like perfection of some sort of world spirit, the idea is that we'll obtain some sort of state that no longer has these contradictions, and it'll be communist, But I mean, what does that have to do with the world spirit? I mean, Marx was completely a non-idealist. It didn't conceive of this in terms of like idealist notions. So, which is again the sort of divide between Hegel and Marx is the divide between a materialist and an idealist conception of this shit. So, good news: the Peru just announced that the leftist won. Man, that election took a long time.
What you have to understand, if we want to talk about it metaphysically, very much so, the concept of deity that Hegel was interested in kind of building, partly out of Christianity, but largely because he believed that Christianity was a colonizing religion to the German people, and he wanted to get back to kind of a more folkish religion. Right. He wanted to get, ein Volk. That idea turned out to work. It's magic in history, if you will. It's alchemy in history, under exactly that idea, to create a folkish religion for the German people, which, by the way, just as a tangent, since we talked about critical race theory a lot, people often see W.E.B. Du Bois as the underlying, kind of the first critical race theorist. He's the guy who comes up. He's not a critical race theorist. That was Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, but he's the root, right? And they say, oh, he had the idea of double consciousness. He had a lot of these writings. Well, where did he get these ideas? He went to Germany, and he studied. He primarily studied the German idealist Herder. And what did he learn from them? Come home, what does he write? The souls of black folks. So he found a folkish religion in identity politics. And so
So did you know this about W.E. Du Bois? Did you know that, Vienna?
Sorry. No, I missed it. Can you...
Well, he argued, so he was talking about Hegel and the Völkisch and all that stuff. And then said that because Hegel was talking about the spirit and wanting to bring a German religion, a Völkisch religion, into German, a non-colonizing religion, as he put it. And then W.E.B. Du Bois went to German and learned about this, and therefore wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk, Folk, which I guess is like near the German Volk. And then since Du Bois also inspired a lot of the critical race theorists, you see there's a connection here between, I guess, like Nazi Germany, Hegel, and leftism. And I tried looking up this claim. I have no. I mean, folk was a word that existed for a long time. How do I know whether or not it came from Hegel or not? You know what I mean? Or like whether or not Du Bois' specific usage in his title was related to somehow being influenced by fucking Hegel.
Actually have this same kind of mentality, this finding that folk religion being very relevant to all of the things that we're dealing with today, if you're willing to trace the lines. But Herder isn't Hegel, of course. This is a conversation for another time. But even there, you see the same influence to create these. It was Hegel's idea to create that folkish religion again for the German people. And then it's a few steps to get from there to critical race theory, even without dipping through the critical theorists and the direct Hegelian line. So this is a very relevant figure who the vast majority of people kind of thinking and talking these days aren't mentioning. They go backwards to Marx and stop.
Right. So why is that?
Why is that? I love like Hegel, and then there was a few steps, and then you have critical race theory. Didn't just a few steps, you know? Do you think that he read Wikipedia and then said, I'm so smart? I'm not sure. I mean, there's some things that he says about Hegel where I feel like he had to have at least picked up the book. To what extent he understood it or like deeply read into it is a different thing altogether. But yeah, I don't think he actually invested too much time in it, to be honest.
Why do you think that it's just because he's the central figure that we can say, well, there's a direct line between Marx and Fabianism, a direct link between Marx and Lenin and Stalin and so forth?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, all these guys were at heart Marxists.
Right.
Lenin's whole point was Marx. You know, you look at Mao and he's talking about Lenin with Chinese characteristics and Marx. And, you know, they were all Marxists. And the critical theorists were critical of Marx, but they were still trying to, what they were actually doing is taking back again to Marx's, they weren't going back to pure Hegelian thought. They were taking the young Hegelian Marx in his very earliest writing, before he wrote Kapital, before he wrote any of this stuff that the critical theorists decided that most of Marx's later works left the Hegelian construct, or metaphysic really, and kind of got off the path by focusing too much on the materialism aspect, focusing too much on the economic aspect, instead of focusing on ideas and culture and the way that ideas and culture interact.
Yeah, evil, just like, not that I want to defend James here, but I think what he's saying here is not that Lenin was inspired by the young Marx, which I agree with you, like a lot of that writings were not like well read back then. He's trying to argue that later figures like Marcuse in the Frankfurt School, which is his main target here, because he wants to jump from the Marcuse school to the critical race theory people and say that therefore, because critical race theorists were influenced by Marcuse, who was influenced by the young Hegelian Marx, and the young Hegelian Marx was influenced by Hegel, that somehow Hegel is the operating system for this whole thing, and therefore it's all shit. That's the argument. And it's really not a great argument, but that's what he's trying to say. Like, I mean, he did get kind of confused there because he started talking about Lenin and stuff like this. And like, all I have to say to that too is like, are we really learning anything new by James Lindsay sitting here being like, well, did you know Lenin was a Marxist? Mao, also a Marxist. Thanks, James.
Now that's a controversial one.
Why? Are you being sarcastic, or is that actually controversial?
Yeah, no, I'm very much being sarcastic.
Okay.
Like,
Good. I didn't know if you had a more well-read. You probably are more well-read on your Maoism, but Lenin was a Marxist. I mean, like, this is why, like, it's so stupid. It's like, look, it really is the Always Sunny in Philadelphia. He's like connecting threads here. Like, look, they're all connected, and it's like, yeah, because people who write philosophy are well read and read a lot of this stuff.
So how do you see Hegel? Let's start with, how do you see Hegel, and as you know, of course, using Hegel as the base, but yet transitioning into something else in Marx? Just where do you see, and what do you see in that?
The best description I ever heard of it, I got made fun of on the internet for this. The best description I ever heard of it was that somebody said, and I took it a step further, but as kind of a mathematics description, was that what Marx did was that he took Hegel, and then he did a change of variables. Okay, so Hegel's variable was the ideas of the world, which were described as, you know, the philosophy of the world. He was looking for a system of philosophy. It's couched in ideas in a kind of very Neoplatonist way, or the currency of what is. And Marx was like, no, we're going to change the variable to the material world. We're not going to float around in ideas. Right. We're going to look at the material world. So what I had said, unfortunately for me, was on Twitter.
I mean, it's weird, him framing it in terms of a changed variable. Like, there's an element in which I kind of get the analogy he's trying to make, but it wasn't simply the change of a variable. I mean, it was a total, like, different perspective on the analysis, being like, we're not just a bunch of people in, like, the marketplace of ideas sitting in our philosophical towers, just, like, coming up with these, like, grand theories. Instead, the world, people respond to their material reality, you know? Is that a change in variable, or just like trying to take a more scientific, sociological approach to the world? You know? What is he even saying?
Jody, I will have you know, James Lindsay is a mathematician.
Yeah.
He knows more than you.
Well, I mean, that's why he has to make some sort of like math analogy here. Well, like, I have a doctorate in math, so what was the one thing that he said that one time where he's like, he talked about two distributions, and he's like, oh, I don't want to confuse all the non-math nerds by me saying two distributions. Yeah. Like, one distribution I could handle. Two? That's more than one distribution.
Twitter was that he had done what's called a Fourier transform, which changes the shape of the curve into another type of curve while retaining all of its information exactly. And then I said he did a change of variables, and then what I said was that the critical theorist ended up doing the inverse Fourier transform, which made people mad. But at any rate, what had happened was when Marx said, I took Hegel and stood him on his head, what Marx was saying, if you want to call it a Fourier transform, I suppose that's fine. What he was saying was, I took the idea, the dialectical process, dialectical materialism that Hegel had, and said, let's take it out of the clouds and let's put it into the world. Right. And so Hegel was still very much in his own odd respect, alchemical respect, in many regards, a theologian. Right. He was talking about the absolute. He's tying it in against Christianity. He's looking to build the roots for a German folk religion. This is not the project of Marx, who said openly that he was at war with God, and that, you know, his soul was already committed to hell or whatever, and he was going to take it down, and that's fine. His was the world. It was, in fact, for him.
So I want to pause there. So him saying that he's at war with God, I mean, like, I haven't read every single thing that Marx has written, but like, maybe we could, you know, if you wanted to quote search that, but like, there's another video of James that we haven't shown where James said that Marx was a Satanist. And I wonder if, like, what he's saying here is some sort of, like, link between his theory that Marx was also a Satanist. And I've never heard that before, other than coming out of this asshole's mouth. But
it just makes shit up. Like,
Well, because like that's going to appeal to his anti-communist Christian friend over here to like try to like refer to Marx as a Satanist. So not only like he's like, see, you're right, Marx is bad, but not only is he bad, but he's also a Satanist, you know. And then the Christianity people are like, oh yes, yes, Marx is Satan. Now we can really hate him, you know.
Yeah, because they didn't before.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they hated him before, but only for the good of the country. Now they can hate him for the good of the religion, you know. Although he was always an atheist, like why the remove? He's not just an atheist. Now he's not an atheist. He's a Satanist. Ah.
I mean, because then James Lindsay would open himself up to critique because he is also an atheist,
Yeah.
and therefore a Marxist, and therefore a Hegelian.
So it's not like Marx wasn't an atheist, but you wouldn't define him as today's Hitchens or Dawkins type of atheist, unlike Feuerbach or Nietzsche. Yeah, I mean, well, he was still an atheist. It just, I don't know how much. It seemed to me, at least from the writings that I've read, that it comes more from a place of like established hierarchies being bad, and wanting to free yourself, emancipate yourself from it, which is fine. I think like there's a lot of threads from that to modern like atheists like myself, you know.
The world was just economics, and so that's what he did, is he brought it down into the world and made it very clearly applicable in a very specific sense. So Marx's project preserved that idea of Hegel, saying let's find the contradictions in everything.
Right.
Let's point out the contradictions. Let's take the worker, let's take the worker and let's show him the contradictions of his existence. And then they will become the proletariat, this awakened worker that now wants to have a revolutionary consciousness to overthrow the forces of capitalism that are keeping him down. And he also preserved much of
So this is another thing. I'm curious what you think, Fieno, because like to me, like I don't read Marx necessarily about I mean there's an element of showing the contradictions, but I think part of what I understand from Marx is less about like showing the contradictions than like explaining the contradictions to people who like feel them. Like I don't know if that like makes sense, but it's like people who exist in a capitalist system usually feel the shittiness of it. You know, they just might not understand why it is that things suck. And so the part is not to like show them the contradictions, which they already feel, but to explain this like, well, why do things suck? Because like the boss is holding back half the stuff that you earned as surplus value, or like, you know, explain why your situation fucking sucks.
I mean, I don't even know if it's so much that, because like, I don't know, I think that the most valuable way to read Marx isn't as like here is, you need to understand the contradiction so that you can overthrow it. It's like, those like thought exercises where like you're trying to explain things to, like you're trying to explain the way that your society works to like an alien or something like that. Marx almost does that, where it's like he takes the like existing structures of capitalism not as a natural force but as a very historical one that is specific and has specific ways of operating, and then he shows that shows that one, they are not transhistorical, they don't go back forever, and two, they won't be around forever, and that like creates that kind of like mental room of like, oh, things don't have to fucking be like this. Like another world is possible type of thing. But like he goes into that like level of like, showing how the world works and how like the logic of capitalism kind of like undergirds all of society to kind of like make it seem as if it is a natural structure. And that's kind of like where his critique of political economy comes into it, is that like, the political economists kind of took notions of value and notions of like labor and wealth as a natural thing, as something that had always existed and would always exist.
Yeah, I guess.
Or if they were earlier, then they were kind of like trying to figure out where it was coming from. it was still like within the transition from medieval to like, or from feudal to capitalist, but like,
I
you
guess
know, is showing that like those structures aren't natural. Those structures aren't.
And I mean, I guess
No,
like in a very
forever.
charitable reading to Lindsay, you can say that that is kind of like showing the contradictions in a way, in that showing that it's not natural, that these things don't just arise by themselves, you know, that they're upheld by certain structures and people.
Hegel's historicism, but he also made that very material.
Right.
So Hegel believed that the ideas of history is the current of ideas through society or through time. And so everything where you hear the postmodernists, for example, say, you know, we have to think all ideas are contingent to the time and place where they were made. You always have to think in terms of spatiality and temporality, because they have to use a unnecessarily big word and use it slightly wrong or whatever to do postmodernism.
You know what's ironic about this is him just fucking talking about, like, what was it, a Fourier transition as an analogy? Like, just to show off of, like, look at me, I'm a big math person, I know big words. And now he's like going, postmodernists using their big words like temporality and spatiality. Get like temporality, time.
Should just say the clock thing.
Yeah.
Clockify.
Jesus Christ.
When you hear that, that's Hegel. Hegel's idea was that the ideas of the time the ideas are the progression of history as they evolve through time. That's the progression of history, and that history becomes perfectible. Well, Marx was like, yeah, that's true. You have these 6 stages of economics, and that's what history is about. He made it material again.
Right.
And so it's the same process of bringing it into the world and standing it into that material process, where for Marx, the historicism was that advanced industrial capitalism will definitely give way to socialism as the proletariat becomes aware of its misery and its dissatisfaction with its circumstances.
Oh, yeah.
That will now become socialism, and then eventually, as the state perfects itself, and that is pure Hegel. Pure Hegel.
That's right. That's
Pure
not Marx.
Hegel.
It is Marx, but it started Hegel.
Yes. So Marx said that industrial capitalism will transition into socialism, and then the state will gradually perfect itself.
Correct.
Through the dialectical process.
Right.
And when that dialectical process perfects the state, all of a sudden the proletariat, who is now the state, will realize we don't need a state. And then we're in the communist utopia. But this,
I mean,
What the fuck?
this is blending, like, there's elements and things that he's saying you can read into Marx, but this is blending a lot of history, like after Marx's death to the Russian Revolution, that like he's like almost like taking those arguments that occurred after Marx's death and then reattributing it to Marx somehow. You know what I mean? I feel like he must have read a book that like touched on these things and therefore thought, like, attributed it to Marx, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like I can see if he read a very like traditional Marxist text, or like if he read a copy of the manifesto prefaced by like a like traditional or orthodox Marxist, then like you could kind of come to this conclusion where it's like,
Because
where you're talking about this kind of like, oh, it is a natural historical process that will just unfold. It doesn't have to be made or created. It is just like, history will just do this on its own, somehow independent of humans, which is the exact fucking opposite thing of what any like decent Marxist thinks.
yeah, I mean,
Also, like, there have been a lot of not decent Marxists.
Yeah,
So
but you could also like argue that Marx wasn't fully clear on this. Like I remember reading like in some of the exchanges between Bakunin and Marx on this point. Not to say that like I think Bakunin was great either, but it was like there's definite like there's tensions there that exist in the Marxian position about how much human agent, like, I mean, like, it's not, there is an element in which it's very materialist, and in some sense you could probably separate that from like people doing things, but then people are also materialists. Like, you don't have to get into like some sort of high-minded idealism to understand that like no, if we all band together and do stuff, like the socialism isn't going to happen if we do nothing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I mean, like, I also acknowledge that Marx was writing at a time where, like, our sort of understanding of agency and will and all that fun stuff is a lot more different today than it was back then as well. Or like determinism and necessity has shifted over time as well.
Yeah. Like, I don't know. And then there's also like this is just like that very basic thing of like, oh, capitalism will just perfect itself and move into socialism. We haven't even touched on like whatever the fuck he was talking about, the state
Yeah.
thing. Like,
Well, that's because like this gets into like the dictatorship of the proletariat and all this stuff, right? And like there's tons of stuff that has been written on this, which is why it's like, and a lot of it doesn't go back to Marx. It's people arguing about like, well, what happens between where we are now and communism and like all those transitory stuff. But like from reading Marx, like he barely talks about that. I think he mentions.
no, I think he mentions it like 4 times total.
Yeah.
Like, he mentions it once in the manifesto. He mentions it in, I think, a critique of the Gotha program.
Yes.
And I think he mentions it like in 2 other places somewhere that I'm blanking right now. But like every time he uses it in a different sense almost. So it's like,
But it was enough that it
yeah,
like
he didn't have a clear idea of the transition either. Like, you don't know what the fuck is going to happen until it happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Marx saw it as going into communism. I mean, like the end point inevitably everyone like agrees that was supposed to be communism. It's just like how that transitory phase exists, you know. And you know, Lenin had a bunch to say on it, you know, but that doesn't mean that like what Lenin said about it is what Marx said about it. Like they're all different people with differing versions of, like, again, Lenin isn't identical to Marx. He borrowed some things, just like other Marxists or people inspired by Marx have their own ideas of what this kind of like phase would look like or whatnot. But I lean more towards the myself of like going like I sympathize with Marx for the same reason that Vienna just brought up, which is like I don't know how the fuck it's gonna if it happens, you know.
This is the same as Hegel saying that the ideas of the time, the Weltgeist, will eventually, through the dialectical process, perfect themselves, and the contradictions will no longer require more synthesis, and the absolute will realize itself. Mm-hmm. And Eric Voegelin describes that as immanentizing the eschaton, which is a very religious way to understand it. We brought about the end of history, if you will. And now we're in what follows the eschaton. Well, in theology, you know, it's end times, and then after Judgment Day, those who are deemed worthy are in the utopia of heaven. In Hegel, we live in a perfect society mediated by a perfect state, and with Marx, that's right. Communist. And so communism was Marx's invention. It's what Marx derived from Hegel.
Mm-hmm. I've never like read back into Marx to get this, but like I do realize that like his perception of communism is a kind of perfected state in that it's supposed to like create the most freedom, I guess, to a certain extent, right? It's supposed to be man as he truly is, right? But like to what extent
but like that's
there's
not...
more to it? Like I don't think Marx ever wrote about it being the end of history, you know?
Oh, he explicitly talked about how like, actually maybe I'm thinking of somebody else, but like, you know, no, like there is no assumption that like communism is the end of history, because it's just like what comes next. It's not like oh, nothing will ever change from here, because that's not how human societies work. Human societies change over time. Like,
and yeah, Livy, like at the end of history stuff is like way past that. That's, I mean, like Fukuyama and shit in the 90s. It had more to do with the liberal order being the end of history, and we see how well that's worked. Or not how well that's worked, but like how Fukuyama was proven completely wrong by life. I'll let you deal with that, Fiona.
And so then all of the left after that has essentially been communist in orientation. And the goal is always push society into socialism, and then we're on the way. And so that's why I think they focus on Marx, is because Marx is the one who made it applicable. Marx, however, wasn't the guy who made it work. That was Marcuse and these later characters. If you want to talk about it being made to work by force, you're looking at Lenin, you're looking at Stalin, you're looking at Mao, you're looking at Pol Pot, these guys. If you want to make it work, however, by changing the culture to just accept it, whether it's the Fabian approach or whether it's the Frankfurt School approach through critical theory, the Gramscian approach through changing the pillars of culture with cultural Marxism, that
Cultural Marxism
is exactly the same idea. And the goal was to create something that was like communism,
Yes.
but not just material.
right.
You know, it's more about culture than it is. So the current
What? It's not just material, it's culture. There's so much like philosophical nuance to this that he's just not. He's like scratching the surface of this, and it's so silly. Let him finish. I will never let him finish. I mean, like, I don't. I mean, you have like lots of disagreements with like to what extent critical theorists and critical race theory and all this stuff is a good approach. But there's still a sense in which, like, yes, these are emancipatory struggles and worth changing the culture to make things better for people. So it's like the other part of this is like he's talking about it as methods to change the culture. And it's like, okay, so let's say that it is a method to change the culture. And that was the intent of these people, is to change the culture. And I think like that in a very simplified form is exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to change the culture. Now the question is, why is that a bad thing? Why is that bad to make cultures understand racial disparities and then wanting to remove them in some capacity? And that's why, like, I've had him. I think he mentions Adorno's essays on jazz in this. He might in a second, so we'll get to that. But there's a sense in which I know James has talked before about like natural hierarchies and like nature. And so it's like, I feel like at the end of his thing, changing culture would be bad because of its effect, or that it's like somehow going to make culture not being what it naturally ends up being, that you're somehow like defying nature by like reshaping culture the way that you want to. And it's like, I don't know, I'm just a little bit more hopeful that things can change, that things aren't so set in stone culturally, you know? And I think there's evidence for that. Look at how much like society differs today compared to like other time periods. Like cultures change all the fucking time.
manifestation of this would be
Jody,
perfect
we're
the
at the end of
culture,
history.
save the world.
Sorry?
I said, Jody, we're at the end of history.
Oh,
Don't
sorry.
you remember?
I mean, it is weird because he kind of does think that in his what he said in the last video we watched, which was that, like, you know, when it comes to fighting the hegemonic power of the church, that fight is over. That, like, we've reached the end. Atheism won. We're accepted now. All is good. We don't need to fight anymore. You know, there is like a weird or like end of history sort of vibe that's coexisting in what he's saying, and yet he's saying that no, it's the Hegelians and the Marxists that are utopian end of history people. Yeah, it's very weird.
Marx's would be perfect the economy, save the world. Hegel's would be perfect the ideas, save the world.
Right.
But it's the same thing. It's just shifted slightly from ideas to economy to culture.
So as if there is a common source for the river that continues. And as that river finds its way and cuts its way through rock, etc., and that sort of thing, to find to go from the source to actually find an end.
Right, and it's going to cut through the softest rock as it goes.
That's right.
That's right. It's going to find its way to whichever rock, wherever, you know, we have there's cracks in it. Wherever there's a crack, it's going to find its way into that weakness. And that's what it's going to erode and expand and make bigger and wider over time. And so that's where you find those sensitive wedge issues in culture and you start exposing the contradictions in them. And what that means in practice is you make people dissatisfied
Right.
with their own lives.
Right.
So he's going to expand on this in a second, and we'll like have that finish out. But just notice like what he's saying here is kind of silly. Like, yes, anyone who's wanting cultural change is going to find the points in culture in which you can exploit to try to get your change, right? And they're going to try to push it and like fight this kind of thing. Conservatives and Christians do it all the fucking time. That's why they call them wedge issues, you know? Like abortion. Abortion is a clear wedge issue for conservative Christians, you know? Like, you're just describing cultural change, and every fucking side does it. It's just weird for them to be like, this is somehow a negative, you know? And, like, the reason why they think it is a negative is because they don't like other people coming in here and telling them how they should live. Everyone should just listen to them, right? So all you people who want to tell me that there's things, racist structures in our society, you're the bad people. We need to get rid of critical race theory. All you people coming in here telling me that hierarchies aren't real and that women should be or that women are not subordinate, you can get out of here because women are subordinate. Like these are like the things that they believe, right? And they don't want you to tell them otherwise. I don't agree that an honest conservative would see abortion as a problem. Yeah, but that's why I mentioned Christian conservatives using it as a wedge issue.
Also, like, up until the past, like, 50 years, it wasn't even an issue. It was a manufactured issue.
Yeah. Created by the
like,
Christian right.
Yeah, to create a wedge issue. Like, just like the CRT bullshit. Like,
well, I mean, just look at it. It's funded by Christian nationalists. Christopher Rufo and this dude are the ones primarily funding the fucking fight. And Christopher Rufo is funded by the Discovery Institute that used intelligent design as a wedge issue to try to remove evolution from being taught in schools. So like, it's amazing how these people are all connected.
The Marcuse and Adorno, for example, were
and I want to pause there just to say, like, notice as well that like the connections I'm making is just like these people are all working together to fight this thing, and I think they're wrong because guess what? Evolution is a real thing, and maybe we should teach it to our kids, right? That's clearly indicating what a problem is. They're just going, these cultural Marxists, they want to make us change. And I'm like, okay, what do they want to make us change? And they're like, they want to make us not be racist. And then it's like, yeah, isn't that a good thing?
Very interested in making people very much dislike their consumer culture, their pop culture. Oh, you listen to jazz music. That was, Adorno's big thing,
Yeah, totally.
rather than high classical music. And
Right.
He was a musician. He was a very prolific composer, but he just hated jazz. Why? Because jazz is eroding the culture.
Right.
And of course, now you look at jazz, you can't avoid. There's a racial component to that statement. And so now you're finding extra cracks within that crack and just trying to erode. And Marcuse was like,
But like finding extra cracks in the crack. I mean, like, okay, Adorno could have been right on some things, but then it's like, okay, Adorno was a bit racist here. Like, why? Like, he's talking about as if that's bad to now point that out or something, or like the cracks are now eroding, and it's like, I don't know. Maybe Adorno shouldn't have said that weird shit about jazz. Maybe it was a bit racist that he did that. Who cares?
oh yeah, you just go to work every day. You think you like your job, but you work every day for some other person to get them richer. And then what do? You
love
come
this
home,
idea.
you watch a commercial and you say, it's not even you thinking, it's heteronomous influences controlling you. And now you're like, I need that sweet Bel Air car, I need that sweet wing on the back. I need this, I need that, I need the blender, I need this gadget, I need all this stuff. And then what? You get up the next morning and go back to the job that you don't necessarily know that you hate, but you hate it.
Right.
Working in inhuman conditions. And we're going to teach you that you hate your job. And we're going to teach you that there's no satisfaction in life to this consumerist life that you live where you enjoy the stuff you do. You like your barbecue with your neighbor.
Right.
No, actually you don't. This is the man exploiting you. Look, you're drinking a brand name beer and you just got advertised to. It wasn't even your idea. This was what how Marcuse looked at it. And so this is the same kind of thing. It's like, how do you find where people are happy?
Right.
And then ruin it so that they're miserable, so that they want to be revolutionaries. And what they call that is exposing the contradictions.
Right.
In other words, in Hegelian language, the life you live is the thesis. Making you miserable about it is the antithesis. And now we'll offer you some new synthesis that we'll call liberation or communism or something great where everything's going to be perfect on the other side as long as we just all keep working on it. And they
Fuck.
Could you, like, it's weird because when he starts that off, you think he's going to go the route of, like, yeah, consumerism does suck. But the end point is, like, no, consumerism is great. You know, the fact that you, like, get up, go to work, and drive your car to that work, to earn money, to pay for the car that you then use to drive to work. And it's this endless cycle, and it's fucking dreary, and it sucks. But he's like, but really, you're actually happy. And you would have been happy the entire time. But out comes this Frankfurt School person who comes and points at you and goes, guess what? You actually don't like that. And materialist consumption sucks. And then you're like, oh man, you're right. I now hate everything, even though I was happy before. But it's like we kind of
I
talked.
was so happy that I could just, like, you know, listen to a lecture or read a single book and have all of it ruined for me and want to kill myself or burn everything down. And it was all this one book or lecture's fault.
Yeah.
Because everything was perfect before that.
We talked about this last time, which I think is, it has more to do with the fact that, like, people are already miserable. The point is, like, again, telling them, like, here's why you're miserable. Like, I don't, which is why, like, I don't feel like a lot of this works sometimes on, like, the middle class, right? Because the middle class is like, oh no, but, like, my life is kind of happy. Like, it's, their happiness comes from the exploitation of others, right? But there's a sense of, like, trying to knock them off their false consciousness is hard. But what we're doing is less convincing people that they're unhappy. Usually people are already unhappy. It's convincing them, as you put it earlier, that the system is not natural. Because most people are unhappy and existing in this society, but they think that this is the best society or the way that it has to be. And so it's more like removing that false consciousness and get them to realize that, like, no, maybe a better future is possible, right? But it's not convincing them that they're unhappy. It almost, you know what it tells me? Because this is a guy who's, like, got several degrees and can spend his time doing this shit. It tells me that, like, he clearly has never been working class in his whole fucking life.
Yeah, that's kind of the big thing. Like, that's the takeaway, is like, oh, you are the petit bourgeois that's, like, sympathetic to fascism because you are worried about becoming lower class, huh?
Yeah. It's like you talk to anyone who's working class, everyone's fucking miserable. Yeah, I'm, like, on variations, you know, it's more like people know that shit sucks. Like, no, people don't want to work a shitty fucking job. How many people come home from their cashier job and just goes, man, I loved it. I nailed being a cashier.
Yeah, that was me today. Got home and I was like, whoo, retail.
Yeah. It's like, you don't usually, and people find, like, people will create a psychological baseline and find some joy in whatever existence they have. I'm not saying that's not possible. It's just that most people will realize that, man, things would be better if, like, I wasn't forced into choosing this occupation to live, you know? It's just that, like, it's, when he said this, I was just like, man, this explains so much. This tells me so much about you, James Lindsay. Jesus Christ.
Hello, my rebels. Hello, my rebels. I'm a good boy. I'm a weirdo.